Good morning, members. All right, so we'll melt some wire ends this morning. I'm going to go ahead and use my butane torch to make it easy on all of us. I got this torch from the hardware store. I might have got it online. It has a little stand and it's filled with butane fluid, just like your lighter might be. You can get the butane everywhere at your local drugstore or home store or hardware store. It has a male spout on it, and basically you just push it into the receiver of the torch and you push down and it does this psh as it's filling up. Once it starts to spit back at you, then your torch is full. This torch is hot enough to melt your small wires, probably up to about 18 gauge, maybe even 16 if you hit it head on. And it should be able to melt your copper and your sterling and fine silver. My torch has a continuous mode here, so if I push that down, the flame will stay lit on its own without me holding the trigger. There's a safety here. I'll pull it down. I'll start the flame, I'll push the continuous, and then I will set it down on its pedestal on top of my fireproof surface, and I'll start to melt my wire ends. I'm working on a fireproof surface, and I have a little glass of water for the quench on my left. I usually work with pieces that are about 4 inches long. That gives me room to melt and then gives me room for some error. And before we start, I'm going to show you the difference. Not all metals melt the same, and because I am not a firework expert, I'm not going to get into it. So you can do your Googling and your homework to learn more about using a torch with metal. But fine silver and argentium silver will melt cleaner than sterling silver. For example, the two that I have on the right are sterling silver, and they're a little bit lumpy. They're still cute, they'll still polish up, it's still very usable. But the three I have on the left are fine silver. You see they're very shiny, the balls are very clean, and because I'm using 28 gauge, I've got a very tiny little end that I was able to melt. This is my preferred wire. Argentium will also melt clean like this, argentium silver. And depending on what size wire you use will help you maybe make a little bigger ball or a little smaller ball. So for example, I wanted really tiny ones. I used 28 gauge. Okay, so I'm going to turn the torch on. Sometimes it takes a couple of times. I'm going to push the continuous button down so that the flame stays on. I'll set it right down here in front of my fireproof surface in case anything from these little molten bead strips. I'm going to melt 26 gauge fine silver. I've got about 3.5 inches here, and I'm going to hold it just above the flame. At the end, you can kind of see that the melting happens right away. Hopefully you could see that. And then my little quench is right here. Dip it into the water and I set it down. I set my next one into my plier and I repeat the process. You're going to continually lower the wire as the ball melts up. And obviously the longer you have it on there, the bigger the ball becomes. But sometimes the ball breaks off. So I find that if you do it above the flame underneath it is kind of helping, you know, to push the ball up into the wire as it melts it. So you can experiment on your wires and see what you can do. Certainly 26 and 28 gauge melt quite quickly, almost immediately. This is 22 gauge wire. And you can see that it happens in about the same way, but sometimes it takes a little bit longer. I'm going to melt both ends of this wire, so I'm just going to flip it over in my plier and come back to the hottest part of the torch here at the tip. And I'll drop it into the quench. I think if you get much bigger than 22 gauge wire, approaching the flame from above might not be the best idea because it might not melt. Some larger wire requires you to either go more head on to the flame and or requires a longer time for the metal to heat up and ball. So here are the pieces of fine silver that I melted. These are the 26 gauge wires. And you can see that the ball size varies depending on how long I kept it in that flame. Here's the melt on my 22 gauge fine silver wires. And again, I like to use fine silver because it makes a very clean, shiny balled end, and I don't have to fuss with too much cleaning. So now I'll show us this whole thing again using copper wires at 26 gauge, 18 gauge, and 20 gauge. Turn my torch on. The flame doesn't need to be full blast. I like to set it about midway. I'll start with the 26 gauge copper wires. Get it into my plier, get it right above the flame at the tip. And you'll see that the copper wire melted, but it was a little bit less fluid than the fine silver. So I'll do that again. And then I drop it into the quench. I'm holding it and it's cooling down, so the metal is black. But if I dropped this into the quench right away, that tip would be red. I don't know if you could hear that, but this one I dropped into the water, and you see it makes the little ball of the copper very red, and I love that for just design. So here now is a piece of 20 gauge copper, and I'll apply the same method and approach it from the tip above the flame, and you can see that the metal is turning red hot, but there's no ball forming. And I can hold it there for a very long time this way and no ball will form. So in order to melt wire, balled ends that's larger, 20 gauge or larger, you hold it from the side like this with your plier. Make sure that you are safe from the flame and you approach the flame head on. Once it starts to melt, I like to turn up to try to get that ball nice and round versus slanted. So I'll show this again with 18 gauge. I'm going to approach the flame head on. And once it starts to melt, I've turned my plier upright so that the ball drop doesn't slant on the wire. And had I thrown it into the quench right away, it would have turned a nice cherry red. So I like to just sometimes, for practice, flip this over and do it again on the opposite side. My flame torch is getting low. I'm not hitting it right on the right spot because maybe I can't see quite right. So sometimes you hit it, if it starts to melt and separate, then like I said, turn upright. The bigger wire takes, a more intense flame sometimes, and certainly it takes a couple more seconds. But if you just remember, at 22 gauge, you can approach it from the top and melt the ball up. At 20 gauge or bigger, you really need to approach the flame head on with your wire. So this is the way the copper ends looked after I melted them. The red one is because I dropped the copper in the water right away, and the other ones cooled down naturally, so they stayed black. To clean this black fire scale off of the wire, I like to use a pickle of white vinegar and salt, just table salt. I have it in a very small crock pot just right over there, right there. That wire is probably not the best thing to see, but it's because I put my camera here. It's not usually here. And to drop these in there for a few seconds will clean all of that black off the wire. It'll also clean the red cherry off the wire. So if you want that to stay red, you just, don't pickle that one. Okay, so I'll throw these into my crock pot here. And then take them out in a few minutes when they're clean. And here's how the fine silver wires looked. The 26 gauge and the 22 gauge fine silver. And they look pretty good. You could clean those if they have fire scale on them also in the pickle, but a lot of times I just use the tops of these, and so the rest of it is for tying on, so I don't bother. But anyway, that's how I do it. I hope you enjoyed that.